Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And continuing from his super presentation on Saipan, Tony returns to look at Guam. Invaded by the Japanese in 1941, it was then liberated in August 1944 after a 3-week battle. Though perhaps not as costly as some other amphibious landings in the Pacific, the weather and conditions made for a tough battle, and it's part of the story. It's part of the island hopping story that we so like to talk about on this channel. A reminder that we are always looking for new patrons, new channel members. Click like and subscribe. Visit my guests' websites, buy their books, etc., etc., etc. But I'll bring Tony in now. Good day, sir. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you? Good to see you again.
Good. We nearly forgot to do the show. We were talking about ceremonies and remembrance and history and historiography. So, but we're here now. So, as I said at the top of the show there, Tony, Guam, when we talked about last time in Saipan and Guam and Tinian, I think when you search it on Google, you get those pictures of the massive great airfields, and it brings up the B-29s. And of course, that is a central part of the story. That's the whole reason why the Americans are going there, is to push that American air power closer and closer to Tokyo in Japan. But sometimes it means, as we said last time on the Saipan show, that the actual fighting for these islands gets a little bit overshadowed by the big ones, by which, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu, perhaps, that are somehow more in the people's collective memory than these other ones that are considered maybe the easier landings, quote unquote. And so, as someone who's traveled these places, it's important we understand that big or small, costly or not costly, it's all part of the same campaign, isn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, as you said, as you travel to these places, you meet people that, have a shared collective memory. We're going to talk a little bit about the invasion in 1941 and then again in 1944. But one of the villages that was on Erenow Peninsula in Guam, the village of Sumai, was just outright destroyed. And every year there's a celebration on Guam, a memorial to the village of Sumai. And we were talking before we went live about survivors of the Second World War that came ashore on Normandy. There's only 2 or 3 survivors of the village of Sumai that are still with us. And yeah, this is a shared living memory that definitely gets lost in the X's and O's and in the broad strokes of the Pacific War. I think a lot of people tend to lump all these conflicts together, all these battles together into one larger conflict, and they're quite different.
And I think, you hinted at it there, that we sort of divide the ETO from the PTO. And the ETO is the one where there are civilians involved in their tens of thousands, hundreds of. The Pacific seems to be devoid of that. We have the same thing about the North Africa campaign. We don't kind of think about the fact the Holocaust got that far and there were genocides and atrocities in North Africa. We think of it as very clean sort of war gaming, generals commanding tanks in the desert, which is an aspect of North Africa. And I think we think the same about the Pacific. It's all just basically uninhabited islands that we just bash our way across. And maybe there's a little bit of kind of inherent sort of racism involved in that. Perhaps they're not the same side of color as ourselves. They're not kind of same kind of culture. So therefore we collectively kind of dismiss them as just being the indigenous. But that's another discussion for the day, or we will maybe get into it later on. But
we will definitely get to that.
And folks, the score, fire away with your questions and things like that. But there we go. Over to Tony.
Okay, great. Hey, WW2 TV fans, great to be back here. I'm Tony Boccia. If we haven't met before, I'm an active duty U.S. naval officer with a specialty in aviation maintenance, currently stationed in San Diego. Prior to this, I was stationed on Guam for 3 years and then in Japan for 15. This is my 3rd time here. As Woody talked about, I did Saipan last time, so now we're going to talk about Guam. And this was home for us for 3 years, so I got to crawl all over this island and see most of the sites that we're going to talk about today. But first, I want to talk about 1941 before we get to 1944. And we're going to talk about the Guam in the larger context of Pacific empires. I don't know how many of you share this idea with me, but I think any historian eventually gets back to the First World War or works their way up.
Separate them. They're all important.
Yep. So this is what the Pacific looked like this is a map from 1921 from the National Geographic Society. And this is what the Pacific looked like in the idea of a mandates, right? So you see Japan up here on the top left corner of the map, and underneath it, you see the Japanese mandate. And this is nearly all of German-held Micronesia north of the equator that Japan captured almost bloodlessly in 1914. They made a deal with the British and the French to keep it after the war in exchange for convoy duty in the Med, and they basically never left, right? One exception, and you can't really see it on this map, but you can see that from the Philippines, there's sort of like a teardrop shape where the American mandate heads east, and Guam is right there at the end of that. Guam was not taken by the Japanese. That was kept by the Americans at the end of the Spanish-American War. And then suddenly in 1919, when the mandate system is approved, the Japanese are right there on the American doorstep. And the supply line across the Pacific from San Diego to Pearl Harbor to Guam and to the Philippines is suddenly surrounded by Japanese lines. And the Japanese absolutely used this to capture Guam in the early days. The invasion force that took Guam in 1941 came from Saipan. And we talked about locals. We talked a lot about it in the Saipan episode, where the Japanese tried to Japanize, for lack of a better term, the locals on Saipan, in Palau and whatnot. That did not happen on Guam. That remained American until 1941. And that'll be important later. So Japanese plans for the Pacific War included capturing Guam in the war's early days. The Japanese recognized the strategic value of this. So from March of 41, the Japanese were flying photo reconnaissance sorties over the island, and plans for the invasion were completed in September of 41. The South Seas Detachment was selected as a main unit responsible for this. And the Americans made it easy on the Japanese by, I don't want to say defunding, but moving resources from Guam in the Philippines to Hawaii, the new home of the Pacific Fleet, and San Diego in the form of shipbuilding. So Guam, not very well defended. Okay, here's a map of Guam, political map in the top left, a topographic relief map in the bottom center, and then a photo, current photo of the Orote Peninsula, Apra Harbor, Cabras Island. So you can see this is the largest island in the Marianas by some measure. It's roughly 30 miles long, 6 miles wide. It's a rough, mountainous south covered largely by jungle and a high plateau to the north. Like Saipan, the island is comprised of rugged limestone and packed coral cliffs. Ridges dominate the landscape and make any movement about the island difficult, particularly in the heavily forested areas. If you try to dig a hole in Guam, you're going to hit about 4 inches of topsoil, and then you're going to hit about 100 feet of packed coral. You're not going to get very far in a short period of time. This is something that the Japanese used to their advantage throughout the battle, and we're going to touch on it quite often. There's dozens of beaches on the island. They're mostly lovely. The largest ones are situated to the west and the south. Guam has a large natural harbor in Apra Harbor. It's north of the Orote Peninsula. You can see that in the photo here on the right. That is now home to the U.S. Naval Base, the Port of Guam, and a large power plant. But in 1941, it hosted the Marine Barracks, an airfield, which you can see in that photo, and the a hotel for the Pan American Pacific Clippers, and several other things such as the village of Sumai, as we talked about. Yeah. You can also see that the highest peaks of Guam are in the south, where the highest peak of Lam Lam, it rises to only 400 meters. These aren't real mountains, but we're going to talk a lot about mountains, quote unquote, in this. So just accept that a mountain on Guam is bigger than a mountain, or smaller than a mountain everywhere else. So that's Guam. We're going to come back to some of these maps to help us out later. Okay, so this is the South Seas Detachment. It was built and organized to capture Wake Island, Guam, and the Gilbert Islands. And the Imperial Japanese Army troops largely came from the 144th Infantry Regiment of the 55th Division in Korea and Manchuria. This force is under the command of Major General Hori Tomitaro, and as part of the Southern Seas Force, the Imperial Japanese Navy had overall control, and about 400 men of the 2nd Maizuru Special Naval Landing Force was assigned as well. We talked about SNLF in the Saipan episode. These are basically Japanese Marines. You'll be well served if you just consider them to be Japanese Marines.
Yep.
Okay, so these units were transported to Guam by 9 transports escorted by destroyers and a mine layer, and then the 6th Cruiser Division also helped out moving them along to Guam, and they all came from Saipan. Now, the 6th Cruiser Division, interestingly, it actually got rerouted from Guam, which didn't need support, to Wake, which did, because the first invasion of Wake went really badly for the Japanese, as most history buffs will tell you. And so they went on to support the landings in Wake Island and leave our story here. And this is going to be primarily an Army story. So on the morning of 8 December, about 4 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese land-based aircraft from Saipan attacked the Marine barracks, the Pitti Navy Yard, radio station, and other targets along the Erenow Peninsula and in Hagana. The air raids went all through that day, all through the next, and the evening of the 9th, the Japanese force left Saipan. The second Maizuru SNLF landed at Dunkes Beach. That's up here in the north near Agana. They swung down. They defeated the Insular Force Guard in the capital of Agana and then moved on towards the Erenow Peninsula. The principal engagement took place in the Plaza de España just before 5 in the morning. That's the old Spanish capital of Guam from the colonial period. You can still see it. It's lovely. What's left of it anyway. And the Americans officially surrendered at 6 in the morning. Did not take long for the Japanese to take Guam. And in the meantime, about 4,800 men under the command of General Hori made separate landings at Tumon Bay in the north, on the southwest coast near Maritzo, and on the eastern shore of the island at Talifofo. The Japanese completely overestimated the strength of the American resistance, almost laughably overestimated. General Hori was named the governor of Guam, and he held that post until the Imperial Japanese Navy occupation force relieved him in March of 42. And this is the Keibutai. We'll talk about the Keibutai a little later, but they're basically a naval occupation. Okay, and here's some images. This top left is the heavy cruiser Aoba. This is the flagship of Cruiser Division 6. Again, not a lot of work to do on Guam. Went to Wake with the other 3 heavy cruisers and got some work in there. You can see the IJA troop transport, the Yokohama Maru. This is one of the transports that moved troops from Saipan to Guam. And on the right, Major General Hori Tomitaro. He's a commander of the South Seas Detachment, a one-time governor. And then a picture taken later after the invasion by Imperial Japanese Army aircraft of the landing beaches at Dunkes Beach. So,
a quick question for you, Tony.
Go ahead.
From the American, a defense against the size of force that came in is very hard. But was there any kind of, we talk about the War Plan Orange and all the sort of the setups for the Pacific being to some extent having been worked out by both sides on the tables for decades. Was there a kind of a plan in place for if at some point in the future Guam is invaded, we will do this? Was there any ability to kind of stick to a plan, or was it everything just too big for them to do anything?
No, I think the plan was that they didn't have a plan, and they were going to consolidate in Hawaii and attempt to consolidate in the Philippines. But there were several things that worked against the Americans in the run up to the beginning of the Second World War. The first was that they're limited in resources and they have to start moving things west. For example, Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii. But also, there needs to be an aggressive shipbuilding campaign. They're going to start leaving treaties on shipbuilding and building up forces that they simply by treaty were not allowed to build up or improve on in Guam and elsewhere. So short answer, no, they didn't have a plan. I think they kind of always knew that Guam would fall and they would eventually get back to it. Okay.
And then just deal with a question that came in from the viewer. Robert Hilton was asking about the economy there. You said in the Saipan one, you talked about sugarcane, things like that. You mentioned the fact there was an airfield on Guam and there was, a hotel, but how was Guam making its livelihood in the 30s?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as a territory of the United States, Guam was really just the crossroads from Hawaii to Manila and points in China. There was not really an economy to speak of on Guam. Certainly not as organized. Nothing was as organized as the Japanese on Saipan, unsurprisingly, and elsewhere in Micronesia, I should say. But even so, not much of an economy. I would say farming, copra, but mostly location. That was their biggest. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so Japanese occupation begins. The Japanese fortified a road airfield. They began building an airstrip at Tian. This was actually unfinished when the Americans showed up in July of 44. So like we talked about, unlike Saipan, there's no large Japanese population, and they begin to Japanize the island. They rename it Omiyajima. That means Great Shrine Island. They were treated very badly by the Japanese, unlike on Saipan and other places in Micronesia, where there was sort of like this gradual move from being not Japanese toward learning Japanese and learning what it meant to be Japanese. In Guam, it's just a fast and furious military occupation. No civil occupation, no civil administration whatsoever. There's two pictures here. The first one shows Chamorros being loaded onto trucks and moved to camps, largely in the south of the island, some on the north and east side. And this was to, quote unquote, protect them from Americans that were landing there. And this is sort of a sticky subject in Guam even today, because there's a lot of survivors of the camps that are still with us. And many people live in the areas around these camps or where the camps used to be. And a lot of civilians were moved out of places like Hagåtña and Sumai, so that way they could be out of the firing line when the Americans showed up. So did those people, survive the engagement with the Americans? Yes, they did. But were they treated very badly and, not given proper food, water, medical supplies? Yes, that's also true. And the Japanese, again, not great at treating non-Japanese very well. The bottom picture is a shot of the Japanese about to behead some locals who have been accused of hiding an American soldier, an American sailor, actually a warrant officer who survived. His name is George Tweed. He survived the Japanese occupation in its entirety, being hidden by local Chamorro families, being moved from village to village. That's what this image shows. And we'll get into this later, but the Japanese, as the Americans started tightening the noose, so to speak, they started acting more and more brutal towards the locals.
And it's worth reminding ourselves that like the Nazis in Europe, they didn't have the Japanese a one-size-fits-all rule about how they would occupy different areas. It depends on the population, the sophistication of the population, what the resources are there, whether or not, as you said, they can kind of Japanesify the population, and the Nazis were exactly the same. How they behaved in Norway was different to how they behaved in Yugoslavia and France. And so I think we sometimes think of a very almost sort of cartoonish, simplified version of the Japanese occupation, and obviously there's lots of brutality and lots of that, but they were in some ways they were quite not sophisticated in their way they would often enforce their rules, but they were quite they had ideas about the different ways they were going to occupy different places, and I think that gets forgotten sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. These islands are all different. Just the size of Guam itself is different, the size of the population and the ability to farm it. Absolutely. Totally different. Okay, so we're going to get to the defense of Guam now. And here's a guy we've seen before, the photo on the right. This is General Obata. He's the commander of the 31st Army, which is stood up in Nagoya in February of 1944. He is overall responsible for the defense of the Marianas. You may remember he was supposed to get back from Palau, where he was inspecting defenses to Saipan, but couldn't make it because the American invasion started. So he just kind of holed up on Guam. To the left is General Takashina Takeshi. We're going to talk a lot about him today. He's the commander of the 29th Division. This unit was activated in April of 41 in Manchuria, and then in 44 was then moved to Guam. The 29th was comprised of 3 infantry regiments, the 18th, the 38th, and the 50th. And those of you with a sharp ear may remember that the 18th Infantry Regiment was attacked, actually, by the USS Trout en route from Saipan, en route to Saipan in February of 44. They lost most of the regiment's men, equipment, its commander. Only 1,800 soldiers survived. They were reorganized on Saipan and then sent to Guam, although 600 men did remain back on Saipan. So the 18th is a lot smaller than it's supposed to be, and that'll be important later. The 50th actually never left Japan and never got to Guam. Then the Japanese realized they needed more troops on Guam because just in case, right? So they started scouring around Japan's forces, and they organized the 6th Expeditionary Force under Major General Shigematsu Kiyoshi, and this included 6 infantry battalions, 2 artillery battalions, 2 engineer companies, including elements of the 1st and 11th Divisions, which actually the first division was the Emperor's own division, as you could imagine it, the oldest of those. Those parts of it were sent to Guam to bolster defenses there on what I think most people in the high command knew was probably going to be a suicide mission. Okay, and then you also see on the slide here that we've also got the 48th Independent Mixed Brigade and the 10th Independent Mixed Regiment. We'll talk about those here in a couple minutes. Okay, so this is a map drawn later. One of the folks that was captured on Guam, luckily, was the operations officer of the 29th Division, and he helped the Americans really understand the Japanese positions and the counterattack plans. So we're going to use a lot of the maps that he had the Marines sketched out based off his debrief. And so as soon as Takashina arrived on Guam, he took command of all the Army and Navy forces. By the 4th of June, that was about 18,500 troops. So he reorganized those smaller straggler units into 2 tactical units for greater efficiency. And this is because, you know, he's got SNLF troops with nowhere to go. He's got air crews with no aircraft. He's got various construction units. He's got laborers. And so these were formed into the 48th Independent Mixed Brigade, and that's 4 battalions. That's under General Shigematsu, who had come from Japan, and the 10th Independent Mixed Regiment, which was pretty much everybody else. So you can see Takashina here on the left in this photo, inspecting the construction of defenses at Agate with Colonel Tsunetaro. He is going to basically fortify Guam to the max extent possible, but there was a great many unfinished projects when the Americans showed up, just like Saipan. There's a shore battery here in between these 2 men that probably remained unfinished. There were coastal defense guns that were unfinished, never fired a shot. We'll see some pictures of those later. So as the time ran out, Takashina turned from big fortifications to small fortifications, and basically adding ammunition dumps, medical supplies, water and food fallback positions all throughout the ridges. But still, even with the limitations, between May and June, the American reconnaissance flights I have here noted 121 previously recorded enemy positions. And that's just the ones they could see, through cloud cover and jungle cover. And that's a lot. So then again, the Americans captured the 31st Army headquarters on Saipan, and they found all this intelligence. So they kind of had an idea of where the Japanese were in Micronesia, between Guam, Palau, and elsewhere. What they didn't know, however, exactly how many troops were on Guam, who was in charge of them, and what the exact defenses were. For example, until the end of the battle, the Americans had no idea that Obata was on Guam. They just did not know that there was another general there. So the Americans knew kind of roughly how Takashina had divided Guam and what to expect from defenses there. And then, of course, they had a healthy respect for the motivation of the Japanese infantrymen after Saipan, and delayed the invasion of Guam a month to allow for, number one, the completion of the Saipan campaign, and also just in case they needed a reserve to take the island. And so here's how Takashina divided Guam, given this extra time. He basically divide the island into 2 defense sectors, and the first one under the 38th Infantry, and that's under Colonel Tsunetaro on Mount Alifan, which is below the Orot Peninsula here. He's responsible for this area, and then and then General Shigematsu is basically in charge of the rest of the island, and he's got some forces down here in the south, some forces in the north, but mostly he's responsible for the northern landing beaches in Assan. And you can see, I've got it in my notes here, but you can see on the map there's various units scattered around the island in reserve and whatnot. And again, by the 15th of July, most of the Japanese are in position. And I've got a quote from the Japanese High Command to Takashina saying, quote, "Seek certain victory at the beginning of the battle to utterly destroy the landing enemy at the water's edge," end quote. And we could talk about this later. I'm sure we will talk about it. We spoke about it during the Saipan episode. This is actually the last time here on Guam that the Japanese are going to try to push the Americans back into the sea. From here on, they're going to their tactic is going to be to just draw the Americans in and fight a war of attrition instead of trying to, it's kind of suicide charge basically to push the Americans into the ocean.
In your reading, Tony, have you seen anything about any possible advantage if the Americans had attacked a month earlier? Because, as you said, yes, that they would have had less of a reserve and they were still fighting in Saipan. But as you also said, it gives the Japanese defenders on Guam another month to get prepared. So, I mean, it's an on long-term military dilemma, isn't it? The longer you leave it before attacking, the better you can make your preparations. But if the enemy know you're coming, they can also increase their preparation. So, have you read anything about a consideration about an early attack having been possibly better?
I don't think it would have been better for the Americans or easier for the Japanese if the Americans would have landed earlier. I think the one thing that did help the Japanese in delaying this was that they were able to better disperse their medical supplies, their food and water, and better secure positions around Mount Baraga, for example, in the center of the island where there's a well of water, and also Mount Santa Rosa, which is their last position. I don't think that it would have made that much of a difference if the Americans would have come.
It's interesting because the 42, 43 era, the Allies are always under pressure to get things done because but 44, they're not taking their foot off the gas, so to speak, but there's a little bit more wriggle room in the time scale. Is that there is a build up happening, the inevitable is on its way. So there's the risk reward balance can be a little bit in favor of, well, let's wait until we're fully ready. You see that in 44 and in 45 as well. Again, that we don't need to just do a risky thing. We can just wait a little bit longer and make sure we've got the superior firepower, the superior numbers that the Allies are kind of banking on in this time of the war.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, the Allies don't absolutely need Guam right that second. They've already got airfields on Saipan and Tinian. On Saipan, but they're going to take Tinian very quickly. And Guam is American. They're going to get it back. The American idea of this was ours. We're going to get it back eventually. But they don't really need it that second. And at the same time, the Japanese combined fleet is not completely destroyed, but was that Battle of Philippine Sea is probably not showing up for Guam. So I think there's probably a feeling in the American strategist mind that they've got time to figure this out.
Yeah. Thank you. Good answer.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is W Day. This is 21st July 1944, and on the left you can see the American landing beaches. On the right you can see the Japanese positions. And again, the Japanese fought tooth and nail every inch of beach. For example, especially in Assan, which we're going to talk about here briefly. So the big thing to remember is that the facts on the ground did not look like the models that the American troops had seen in the briefs. The Japanese had built huge fortifications and obstacles. For example, they built bunkers of coconut logs, 20 feet across, and then filled them with boulders that created bottlenecks on the beaches, the approaches to Assan Ridge and the road to Hagana. There were concrete blockhouses on Gon Point at Agate, holding 75 millimeter and 37 millimeter guns. There was a 75 millimeter artillery piece on Yonah Island. Now, many of these emplacements did not show through the cloud cover and, in the aerial photography. So the Marines and soldiers had no idea that these were here, although they probably guessed that they were. They didn't actually know. And then the big thing is that the Japanese troops are able to fall back to rear positions for water, for ammunition, for medical attention that the Americans just can't fall back to. There's a lack of, just jumping over to the American lines real quick, there's a lack of LVTs and tractors and things like that just to get the Americans from the ships onto the beaches in Guam, because they were either tied down in Saipan, had been wrecked, destroyed, needed maintenance. Many of the troops attacking Guam are waiting from the reef line to the beach the entire way, a couple of 100 yards, where they would have been in an LVT previously on Saipan. So these were easy targets for the Japanese. But here, and we talked about the incomplete status of the defenses. is this really served Takashina badly. He almost certainly would have been more effective in preventing the Americans from securing the beachhead in Agate. And again, this is south of that peninsula here on the west side of the island. And probably at Assan as well if the weapons had been ready. The goal of the Americans is to capture Mount Alifan. If you remember, that is the headquarters for the 38th. That would bottle up the rest of the Japanese reserve in the south and also secure the southern position around Arot Peninsula, because what they want to do is capture the Arot Peninsula for the airfield and the port. So just before midnight on day one, the Japanese sent a charge against the lines of the 4th Marines. They basically fired mortars for about 30 minutes and then overran the Marine lines with fixed bayonets. And this is on day one, right? So again, trying to push the Marines into the sea. Roughly 100 Japanese soldiers infiltrated the lines that night as well. They were sabotaging howitzers and mortars or cutting communication wires, picking off Marines. These are all largely unsuccessful, but I pointed out to say this is the aggressiveness of Takashina following his orders from Tokyo to just push the Americans back. And again, unsuccessful. The next day, there's a small rise called Hill 40, which is on the way to Mount Alifan. That changed hands 3 times. And in the course of that, the 38th Infantry Regiment was wiped out. Most of the survivors fell back to Mount Alifan. And with the fall of Agate, the road to Mount Alifan in southern Guam is opened. And the Japanese did attempt to stop the American advance here using some tanks and medium artillery, but not organized. And the Mount Alifan itself fell on the 22nd. So this is the southern landing beaches, and it's already secured by the 22nd of July. Now the 3rd Marine Division is coming ashore north of the Arot Peninsula, and the 48th is holding that point. And I want to, we're going to flip over to some maps here. But if you look on the right-hand picture, on the left is Assan Ridge, and on the right is Adelup Point, and the Marines call these the Devil Horns, right? So Adelup Point, where that little red tag is, that is just limestone cliff covered with jungle, and is basically, because of this, the position of Arot Peninsula is out of sight of ships that could hit it out at sea. And the Japanese defenders had an absolute, I mean, you could see it here, just a beautiful firing line from Adelup Point down Assan Beach to the Marines. And so they're just, putting constant mortar, heavy machine gun fire, small arms fire on the LVTs that did exist. But also, as I said, the Marines are wading ashore and they're just easy targets, however 60 something pounds worth of gear with a rifle and everything, trying to slog your way through sand. And it's just not easy. And the Japanese are doing very well here, all things considered. And the Americans just did not capture this until they already had most of the division ashore at Assan Ridge. To the left, the left-hand Devil Horn, as they say, that's a ridge that basically is the high ground. It's heavily fortified. The Marines only were able to overrun Assan Ridge. You're going to see some pictures later after they brought artillery ashore. Even motivated Marines with, heavy machine guns, light machine guns, and grenades couldn't capture Assan Ridge. It was very heavily defended. Okay, so now we're going to get into the Japanese counterattacks, and this beach shows, or this map shows the beach at Assan with the Devil Horns, right, of Adelup and Assan, and you can see the Cabras Island here on the right-hand side of the image. Now there's a causeway that connects this to the main island of Guam. This is actually where the port of Guam is and a large power plant. But at the time, this was just an island. And to get across here was very difficult. There was reefs, breaking surf, and the Japanese had fortified it very heavily. You can see a picture of an example of a fortified bunker there at Cabras Island. Now destroyed, but this picture is post-war. And then a light tank that would have been part of the Japanese counterattack. So the Japanese had 2 problems here. The first was to prevent the Americans from creating any more of a beachhead at Assan and Agate. And the second was to keep those 2 invasion forces from joining up and cutting off the Arot Peninsula. So as the Marines attempted to swing around Arot, they actually found that the Japanese had thoroughly lined the roads and beaches with landmines, booby traps, and I read this, which is just crazy, is that they actually buried fused torpedoes and aerial bombs in the ground, which, you know, if you know anything about anything, you know that torpedoes pack quite a punch. I can't imagine what a torpedo as a landmine looks like. That's just unbelievable to me.
And it's for me as a Normandy guy, Tony, it's a reminder that that the Allied soldiers in Normandy, even if they didn't fully comprehend perhaps in advance the difficulty of the blockage, they did at least know the road layouts. They knew where the choke points were. They had that ability to just pour over thousands of aerial photos. And it seems that whenever we get the Pacific, even in 44, when things are going the Allied way, there's still a little bit of a, well, you'll kind of find out when you get there. And then when the Japanese then start doing their own counterattacks, which you can't possibly anticipate what the enemy are going to do in front of you, the Americans are now going to work everything out on the fly in terrain that they're learning how it works as they push across it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's and even when you do get there and you do see it, you know, to call this a road, for example, you know, is generous. It's really just a track through the jungle, you know. And, you know, there's, you know, when we get to Font Plateau later, you know, there's a drop off of, you know, 60 feet on one side, and then there's just straight cliff on the other. And, you know, it's like, man, really, this is a road? Where I feel like in Normandy, you know, if you say something's a road, it's probably a road. It's probably not a cow path.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm thinking of is that hesitancy is going to kill you. You know, if you're always stopping as an American force and going, well, hang on, where is the artillery coming from? Which would be the best way to envelop that position there? Should we go this way? Should we go that way? The more you're stuck with the Japanese who've been there for so long, they know the little passageways, they know the gullies, they know the tracks, they know which ones they put the torpedo anti-personnel mines in, which is a crazy thought. And so there's that ability for the Japanese kind of to lead the Americans into the places they want them to go, where they've got defenses. And just because we, you know, you're giving us a timely reminder of just because we know what the outcome was, and even the planners probably knew what the outcome was going to be. The Japanese will be defeated within a certain period of days here because of the firepower bringing to bear. At the time, if you are an American Marine or soldier on that island, it's very much a living minute by minute, not knowing that future. You know, you've still got to take out every, as you say, coconut, log, bunker, every booby trapped track, etc., etc. And it's, you know, it's reminding us that the time and place is as important as our contextual understanding of the invasion or the liberation.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. That's a really good point. I just want to point out here, when we're talking about these Japanese counterattacks, and you're talking about, you know, the ability of the Japanese to understand the facts on the ground because they created them themselves.
Yeah.
You know, Takashina, he's watching all this from Font Plateau, and he's seeing, you know, Assan is going, Agate has already gone. And so he has this counterattack idea in mind, and he basically just sends the majority of his troops that are in this area down to Assan Beach to try to push them out. And there's a short, you know, mortar barrage, and then 1,000 Japanese soldiers, for example, just kind of appear out of nowhere here in the center, and they completely overran the lines of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. They killed roughly half the men there. Their own losses were about 950 killed, and a lot of these soldiers that are coming down from the cliffs across this line here have magnetic mines, TNT, the grenades, and they're trying to destroy themselves along with equipment. They lost about 3,500 men in this charge, and this is the breaking point of the whole Battle of Guam. And, you know, your comments really make me think, if they had just played this a little smarter and not tried to charge down, you know, the beach and try to push the Americans back. I often wonder what the Japanese were thinking at the time. Did they really think that they would contest the landings to the point where the Americans would just start putting troops back on ships? It's crazy to me to think that they thought that was a possibility, but
it's like they try and do both when they should choose one. They try and both. It's the Rommel dilemma about Normandy. Rommel and the other guy, I can't forget his name. anyway, the German commander, you know what I mean. Anyway, in that you either try and stop them getting on the beaches, or you kind of hold inland and let them come to you. But it seems here they try and kind of do both of it, and it's like, well, one or the other would be the better option. Yeah. But I guess, it's fascinating stuff, though.
It is. So Assan is now captured, and Agat is captured, and now the Marines and soldiers have the ability to meet up and cut off the Erenow Peninsula. So on the Erenow Peninsula, there's Commander Tamai Asaichi. He's from the Japanese Navy, and he's the commander of the 263rd Air Group. He's roughly got 2,500 troops. He's got the naval garrison, the KB Tyler we talked about earlier. He's got the remnants of the 38th that fled from the fall of Mount Alifan. He's got 2 companies of anti-aircraft troops, squadron guys, maintainers, all kinds of random stuff. So on the 25th of July, he attempts to evacuate his force by barge from Erenow down to southern Guam. However, he's recognized immediately, and then the barges start getting picked off by American ships. And so then he just decides to try to break through the Marine lines. Basically, a bunch of boozed up Japanese soldiers and sailors, rushed the line. We read about this and talked about it in the Saipan episode, but we call it a bonsai charge now. They would have called it a Gyokusai charge. Gyokusai means smash jewel, with the idea of, destroying something beautiful so it's not captured by the enemy or taken by anybody else. And this is the beginning of the end of Erenow Peninsula. There's still some delaying action, some rearguard action that happens here. But once the peninsula is taken, that's it. The Battle of Guam is essentially over. And again, the operations officer for the 29th Division, his name is Lieutenant Colonel Takeda. He later wrote, and when he was getting debriefed by the Americans, and I'm going to read his quote in partial here. Quote, "It was estimated that it was no longer possible to expel the American forces from the island after the results of the general counterattack on the night of 25 July. After this was decided that the sole purpose of combat would be to inflict losses on the American forces in the interior of the island. The chief reasons for the estimate was that 95% of officers were killed in the counterattack on the 25th of July. Morale was low. 90% of weapons in that area were destroyed, and combat ability greatly decreased. The Erenow Peninsula was taken, and there was no expectation of support from Japanese naval and air forces outside Guam," end quote. So the Japanese have pretty much gave up at this point, if you're reading this correctly, and the idea shifts from fighting the Americans to just making the Americans bleed as much as possible. Option 2, as you might say. And so on the 28th 3rd Marine Division, they take Fonte Plateau, with the exception of the Ridge, which fell the following night. The Japanese army made no less than 11 attempts to get through the Marines' perimeter. They suffered about 800 casualties. And this is the turning point of the campaign, right? And as this turning point comes to pass, the locals are starting to come to the American lines. And these numbers are just unbelievable. So we're going to step away from the Japanese one more time. And just to give you these numbers, there's an estimate that by the 31st of July, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps had 1,331 civilians under their care. By the 2nd of August, it was 5,500. And on the 4th of August, it was 12,000. These are, locals that are just swelling the American lines that, are trying to help, really. There's a plaque, I'll always remember the site of this, in Guam International Airport, that says that Guam was liberated by 2 groups: Americans who came from the sea and Chamorros who came down from the mountains. Mm-hmm. And, that feeling on Guam, that local feeling of, we did this, we liberated Guam. The Americans showed up to help us because they didn't have the equipment or whatever. But Guam was liberated by Guam. That feeling is very strong on Guam even now.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you.
No worries. There's also a report, and this is not from the Japanese sources, but from the American sources, that on the night of in the afternoon of the 28th, there was a full dress military parade in Agana among the ruins of the capital. The Americans are watching this from Fonte Plateau. If this is the case, and this is, again, not backed up by Japanese sources, but if this is the case, it's possible that this is because General Takashina was killed on the afternoon of the 28th from machine gun fire. And so General Obata now takes charge of the forces on Guam. All told, he had about 8,500 men. Only 6,000 of them are combat troops. They started with 18,500. They've lost a lot of men so far. And Obata orders a general withdrawal to the north around Mount Santa Rosa. And he has two places where he's going to put some troops and try to prevent the Americans from getting to Mount Santa Rosa too quickly. And this is at the village of Finagayan and Mount Barragata. And so you can see Mount Barragata, as we looked at the relief map, not very tall. The Americans are trying to capture this in 3 separate columns, but the Japanese squeezed that into 1 column and fought a very tough action going uphill toward a very important strategic location of the village of Baraga, which had a well that provided 30,000 gallons of fresh water a day. So super important when you're invading a tropical island in the summertime. But also there's a supply dump there. And Mount Barragata is also very close to Tion Airfield and the approach to Mount Santa Rosa. The Americans take this with some difficulty. Then they turn to Finagayan Village. And here the Japanese are using the road that you can see here on the picture on the right, the road from Agana up toward Finagayan. You could see just in this map that was drawn much later that the Japanese are using the road and the natural ridges of the natural facts on the ground to really corral the Americans into a certain area. And again, this is effective, but the Japanese don't have the men or the material to really keep this going. And they slow the Americans down, but they do not stop them. Okay, so this is northern Guam. The Japanese fought very hard around Mount Santa Rosa. In the afternoon of the 7th of August, as the 77th Army Infantry Division drove toward Mount Santa Rosa, they found a network of octopus traps, which is what we call foxholes, opened up on the Americans and slowed them down. There was probably about 110 to 150 troops around Mount Santa Rosa. They stopped a full American battalion from advancing for 6 hours.
Wow.
Further on, a small position formed around 2 light tanks, an anti-tank and 20 millimeter guns, and a makeshift infantry battalion. That stopped the American battalion completely for the day. However, during that day, the 3rd Marine Division is able to move roughly equal with the Army lines. And then again, on the 8th of August, that position was captured. So even when the Japanese are giving it their absolute all, they're still unable to stop the Americans for more than 8 to 10 hours. As the Americans approached Mount Santa Rosa, however, the Japanese bled out through the lines. About 4,000 of them escaped. These are troops and laborers combined. As the position was captured, they fell back to Mataguac, and on the way, they killed and in some cases beheaded some 50 local men of the surrounding areas, probably to keep them from discussing or telling the Americans where their positions were, which, as we'll see, did not work. So on the evening of the 8th of August, the general staff in Tokyo, they'd been notified by Obata that the Americans held 9/10 of the island and the collapse of Guam is imminent. And by this point, the Japanese had lost the northern point of the island in Ritidian. They lost all the landing beaches and all the airfields. The last command post, which we're going to show some pictures of, fell on the 11th. Some locals told the Marines that there was an underground bunker at Mataguac. This turned out to be a huge space, roughly 100 feet by 40 feet, in which the Japanese held out to the last man. This is the last organized resistance on Guam. And Lieutenant General Obata killed himself here 1 day after the message was sent from the Americans confirming the fall of Guam. At the time, on the 11th, the count was 10,970 Japanese troops killed. Later estimates have it more than 18,000 dead and 1,200 captured. And I'm just going to go through some pictures here. This is 6276. It's a Japanese midget attack submarine. This is the same type as was captured at Pearl Harbor in the opening days of the Second World War in the Pacific. They are the only 2 complete extant examples. The Pearl Harbor boat, HA-19, it's in the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. I've not been there, but it looks just like this, and I look forward to seeing it. Anybody could go see this. This is not behind a fence or anything. And this is at the Museum of the Pacific War in Guam, just outside Naval Base Guam. These are some fortifications at Agate, again, south of Erenow Peninsula. You can see some, light artillery. You could see some fortifications here. And anybody could go here. I encourage you to go see this. This is not a very big area. And when you look at just the sheer numbers of Japanese and Americans killed, it's truly unbelievable to imagine that much death in such a small space. We talked about Gettysburg before we went live. This place is kind of like that, where you're just like, man, how did 10,000 men fit here, let alone fight here? These are some Japanese cave fortifications on the Erenow Peninsula. This is on Naval Base Guam, so you got to have a pass to get on, or have somebody, maybe your friend Tony, escort you on. This is unfortunately, these are not very detailed photos, but this is about as close as you can get. I would not get any closer than the picture on the right. There's unexploded ordnance. There's pitfalls and traps and all kinds of stuff. I don't want to take the chance that there's a buried torpedo somewhere in the area just waiting to cook off. But the Japanese held out here for some time. It took about a week to capture the Erenow Peninsula fully. This is at the bottom of Assan Ridge. There's this fortification here. It's an old Japanese bunker. There's no weapon in there, but there would have been a field piece similar to what we saw not a field piece, but a coastal defense weapon similar to what we saw at Agate. And this is a view from the top of Assan Ridge looking north. And you can see the road there on the right-hand side of the picture heading up towards Haganya. And you can see somewhat of Invasion Beach there. And you can see this is the high ground. You could somewhat see Adelup Point there in the very, very background between the Devil's Horns. This is where the 3rd Marine Division came ashore. These are the pity guns. We talked about stuff that was not ready. This is them. These are 3 Vickers coastal defense weapons. These were dragged up here. The concrete was poured. They were set up all using forced Chamorro labor, and then they never fired a shot because they were not ready. There's these 2 guns, and then there's a third that has since fallen over because of a typhoon or an earthquake or something. But these guns are just amazing. Unlike the other places on Guam where you can kind of see the power boats on the water and you could kind of hear the traffic and maybe hear music from somebody partying down on the beach, this is in the middle of quiet jungle. It's dead silent here. It's unbelievable. There's not a better example on Guam of the futile defense on Guam than the PD guns. And this is from the top of Assan Bay Overlook and nearby Font Plateau. There's a memorial here to the Chamorros who died during the occupation and during the liberation of Guam. And you can see there's a great view of Assan Ridge and the landing fields, and with Erenow Peninsula to the left out of shot. And the South Pacific Memorial Peace Park. This is at the side of the Mataguac Command Post. There's this big memorial here on the left, and behind where I took this photo is a chapel that's dedicated to peace and is filled with positive messages of hope and anti-war and so on, and has some artifacts from the war. This monument in the middle is actually to the 38th Infantry Regiment. This is probably the biggest and most complex of the unit monuments, and there's many smaller ones. There's a tiny one that's only about, maybe 6 inches by 4 inches that's buried in the ground that you could barely see, and that's to the 5th Hospital Corps, which I think only had about 100 men in it. And then to the right, finally, is the sign marking the spot where the Americans first dynamited it closed and then dynamited it open, the last command post where General Obata finally sent the message that Guam had fallen to Tokyo and then committed suicide. And all these places and more are yours to see if you ever make it out to Guam, and I hope that you do. But that's all I got, and I'll take your questions.
Oh, well, brilliant stuff. As before, Tony, great stuff. We have a few comments and questions, so we'll bring the 77th Division up in a little bit because I think they're overlooked a bit. So first is a book recommendation. Kevin is saying The Liberation of Guam by Harry Gailey is a good read. I'm sure you've read that as well. And Terry makes a good point about Guam was a very solid operation from the US point of view, excellent cooperation between the 3 services, and you get another shout out for the book there. And I think that's the point we're trying to make, is that an operation can basically go to plan with everything working as well as you can expect but still be interesting in terms of the loss of life. I mean, the casualties there. 1,500 Americans killed, 3 or 4, 5,000 wounded, civilians wounded, killed as well. Just because something is going to go the way you expect it to go, doesn't mean that the deaths along the way aren't still worth honoring. It's still worth looking at the actual, as you have done, the campaign battle by battle, battle by battle. And I think it's why, as we said, campaigns like Guam can be overlooked in favor of the ones where there was perhaps more likelihood of different outcomes. Possibly there were things could have gone. Guam was going to go one way, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I agree. So the liberation of Guam by Harry Gailey. Thank you. I've written that down. I will definitely check that out, and I'll add that to the reading list on my website. Thank you for that recommendation. And I agree. Like, Guam is sort of one-dimensional compared to other battles, such as maybe Saipan or Okinawa, or maybe there's a question that it didn't really know what to expect. It could go a different way. And just to put in a plug for Palau, and specifically Peleliu, you and I might get to this at some point, do something on Peleliu.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
But yeah, that'd be great, because Peleliu is kind of like this great, along with Tarawa, like the two great unknown and unheard of Pacific battles, right? That I think people outside the discipline don't really know about. And the sad thing about being an American is that most Americans have no idea where Guam is. You couldn't point it out on a map, right? So yeah, I think it's important to talk about this, because there's real people that really suffered, and they all deserve to have their stories told.
Jason is asking about other recommendations for books. So the Gailey one came up there. I mean, obviously you lived on Guam, you said that earlier on, but is the memorials and the museum that's there, but any other particular resources you think are worth mentioning?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's a great online resource, The Recapture of Guam by Major O.R. Lodge. I used his work to get some of the maps and some of the details on the Japanese positions. He has a lot of sources in there. And of course, Horn Fisher, every great student of the Pacific has to get back to Horn Fisher eventually, because he just, one of the first things I do is one of the last things I do after I finish his book is I just go to the bibliography and just start add everything in there to my reading list too. So if you're new to this, if you're interested in this, I would definitely stick with Horn Fisher. And there's a great book that I cannot remember the name of, and it's somewhere on this bookshelf behind me about, I'll drop this to you.
We'll add it later on. Yeah.
There's a book on the camps in Guam that I actually picked up there at the museum. That's fantastic. And talk about a story that's not told is that. So, yeah, good question.
Ian Carr is asking about, is there a program still for clearing munitions? I mean, obviously it is an active base. There's military personnel there. There's civilian personnel. Obviously there's certain bits the public can't go to, but is there a program, or do things just occasionally get found by accident?
Both. So when I gave my tour on Guam, when I gave those tours on Guam, I should say, the first thing I did was tell everybody, don't pick up anything shiny. Don't pick up anything that looks metal, because it could be UXO and it could hurt you. So there is absolutely a process for finding unexploded ordnance around the island, and they do find some on accident too. Not as much as I think they find in places where there's less civilians. For example, on Iwo Jima, they're always finding unexploded ordnance as there's earthquakes and landslides and whatnot. They are definitely finding some.
Well, in my rationale, one unexploded piece of ordnance is one too many. I mean, you don't have to have many to be a dramatic, So
100%.
One grenade I dig up in my garden is one too many, as far as I'm concerned. We had a question from David about what, as someone who's been there, what would be the best time of year to visit Guam, weather-wise, busyness, whatever.
Yeah. So Guam is a tourist destination for the Japanese and Koreans. And so I would definitely go to Guam when it's not in those tourist seasons, meaning the spring, late spring and early summer. I would also recommend going in the dry season, which is December, January, February, when it's not as humid out there. I think it must have something to do with the trade winds, but it's just not as humid there and not as rainy. if you go to Guam anytime between late spring and early fall, you're going to get rained on at least twice a day. So you got to be comfortable with that. Bring a rain jacket everywhere you go.
Yeah.
But I would definitely go in the dry season.
Okay, thank you. And Pal is saying, is a nice compliment. Tony seems like someone you would have a beer with after tour. There's a compliment there. You get your history information, and then you have a beer with them afterwards. That's praise from our Dane there. But
cheers, thanks.
I said we wanted to mention the 77th Division because we did a show with Emerson Ford recently about her novel What the Silence Say, when she was researching her relatives, and the 77th came up, and I will ask at one point to come back and do a 77th divisional history show, because she got really dig into the weeds on that. And I think, I don't want to get into the perceived rivalry between Marines and the Army that the sort of is there, but I think we've kind of maybe moved on between that. But Kevin made the point earlier on about Howlin' Mad Smith was very complimentary of the 77th. Terry said the 77th, National Guard division from where he's from, and they went on to do Leyte and Okinawa. And I think the fact that stuck in my head from Emerson's presentation is the average age was high. It was early 30s in the 77th division because of just how it had come together. And I'm assuming that on Guam, the museums obviously honor the fact it is multiple services there. It's the Coast Guard, it's the Navy, it's the Marines, it's the Army, because the old 1950s movies of it always just being the Marines, we have moved on from that now, haven't we? I think, and people understand that the Army were pivotal. I mean, John McManus did a lot of work. So anything to particularly say about the 77th from your point of view in terms of the research?
Yeah, I would say like the big thing is, we talked about the delay in the Americans actually getting to Guam from Saipan. And I think one of the reasons that was helpful is it allowed the 77th more time to interact with the 3rd Marine Division and kind of get involved with the planning, understand the requirements. And there was a feeling among, certainly between Major Bruce of the 77th and General Geiger of the Amphibious Corps commander, that we're in this together. Where I think, Holland Smith, who I think is great, not exactly a team player, especially, interdisciplinary team player, one would say, that I think Geiger was just better at that. And given more time, that only helped the 77th. There's a monument to the 77th at Assan Ridge. And it's actually combined with some other monuments, but it's not like it just says, hey, this is to the soldiers and Marines that liberated Guam. It specifically mentions the 3rd Marine Division and then the 77th Infantry Division. So there is a great amount of pride on Guam for the 77th. I look forward to a talk on that. That would be fantastic.
Well, I mean, eventually we'd like to get to all the American divisions, all the Canadian divisions, all the British divisions, all the RAF squadrons, all the American Air Force. It would be great if I could live to be 1,000 years old and get there eventually. And it's and thank you for filling in the gaps about Guam, because I think most of us have heard of it, but we don't necessarily find it easy to place on a map or think of the timeline. And I say we do think of the big, not saying that Guam isn't the big one, but we think of the Okinawas, we think of the Iwo Jimas earlier, and even in 1941, we think of Wake Island, perhaps we think of the British in Singapore, but we forget that the Japanese are taking these places like dominoes for a few days there. And I think the international date thing confuses people, because it's happening a day later, but it's not really happening a day later. So I think, again, we look at that 41 era by the very, very dramatic, well-known instance, Pearl Harbor, Singapore, Wake Island, but forget that Guam and countless other places had an invasion.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more we talk about it, again, it's not getting easier to teach history. I think we talked about this the first time we discussed this. It's not getting easier to teach history to the younger generation, and it's the next generation, I should say. So any chance we get to talk about it, man, we got to do it. Can I just mention that I saw somebody in the comments said Spruance needs more respect. I cannot agree more. I'm a big Spruance fan, less of a Halsey fan. I think
Fletcher came up as well. Fletcher came up as being under-regarded, and I think this is the thing, is we're in the era now where we have the waves of how some of these admirals and generals go in and out of fashion depending on the writing at the time. Montgomery in the ETO is probably going through a bit of a renaissance right now, having been everybody's favorite general to despise for a long time. And I think Halsey had been at the top of a tree for some time, maybe dropping down a bit, say Spruance coming up there. But that's the evaluation that people are doing, bringing different perceptions to it, and perhaps without some of the old biases. And again, how influential the movies were in some of these portrayals.
Absolutely.
You know, Robert Mitchum as Halsey in Midway, for example, and didn't James Cagney play Halsey in one movie? I think he did.
Maybe.
I think he did. Or was that with someone else? But anyway, we go on and talk about movies. But we definitely invite you back to do something else in terms of Pacific Islands and invasions. But in the meantime, it's been great speaking to you, folks. As I say, thanks to the new patrons who signed up today. We're back with Jamie tomorrow talking about his grandfather's throne. That will be an absolute doozy. Next week we've got shows on Monty's performance near Corres being reappraised. We've got Phil McCarthy coming on talking about the British Brigadiers in Normandy, so a bit more British stuff again, and then lots more stuff. So also click like and subscribe and you'll find out what we're doing. But anyway, I'll see you all tomorrow. Cheers then. Cheers, Tony. Bye.
See ya.